Maria Callas is somebody I remember from my childhood, in the sense that her voice was always being, my mother loved her music, and I remember listening to her sing and thinking, wow, what is this? And I mean, I understood the power of her voice at a very early age, not because I'm particularly precocious, but because I could see the way that my mother was would be in tears. So I understood that it was a big deal. And then um, coming back to this theme of, trying to look at familiar stories in an unfamiliar way, I started in lockdown reading a lot about Maria, and I read all the books about her, and I was really interested. They all seemed to kind of give her a hard time. And, you know, it's an interesting thing because she was such a famous woman. I mean, she was, up there with Elizabeth Taylor and Audrey Hepburn in the 50s. She was a household name, iconic, cover of Time magazine. I mean, today there aren't that many operas. I don't think there are any opera singers that have that kind of cachet, but she was a global icon. And I, and yeah, all these books was either gave her a hard time for losing her voice, or they gave her a hard time for, you know, getting together with the Nazis. And they either blamed her for losing her voice because she got together with the Nazis, or they just sort of said, well, she wasn't nearly as good in 1963 as she was in 1953. It's that kind of stuff. And I just thought, well, this is really very unfair, because here is a woman who's broken the mold, who kind of made opera sexy, who became went from being £220 to £130 in 6 months, so that she could actually play these roles with a degree of dramatic verisimilitude, which, because, if you only care about the voice, it doesn't matter whether the woman singing, whether the woman playing Violetta, who's a kind of dying of TB, is big or small. But if you want it to be a dramatic performance, then she's got to look like she might be dying of TB, i.e., quite skinny, and so she loses the weight, and she suddenly becomes, I mean, she'd always been famous for her voice, but suddenly she becomes this kind of the whole package, because she's also an incredible actress. So she can act, she can sing, and she looks the part. And that is unheard of, basically, in opera terms at that point. And so she's, and she's very beautiful, and she's very elegant. I mean, it's a whole thing. And she's also gives performances like no one else. So it's not just that she's, well put together. She's just extraordinary. And anybody who's seen Callas just says how amazing it was. What an incredible experience. And so I wanted to kind of redress the balance a bit and write about her as a heroine, as a diva, as a goddess, rather than as this woman who had somehow failed. Because I don't think of her as a failure at all. I think of her as somebody who, she was the first woman to get paid the same as the men, as the male singers. She demanded, she demanded to be treated as well, if not better than the men, and she got what she asked for. And I think that's an extraordinary, it's a big ask in the 1950s. She took control of her career. She took risks. I mean, I just think, wow, this is a woman who needs celebrating. And so I've written a book as, from the point of view of a woman whose real tragedy is that her voice is beginning to go. And so when she meets Onassis, she knows that she hasn't got that much longer at the top of her profession. And so she allows herself, and it's clear that that's what happened, to fall in love. And so it's not like she chose between opera and Onassis. I think if she'd still at the top of the game, Onassis would have been she wouldn't have given him a second glance. But I think she also felt, well, I'm not going to be able to sing as much as I used to, but hey, I found love. Because although she'd been married, I don't think she'd ever really understood what it was like to have a proper relationship, a truly passionate relationship with somebody. And so when that happens to her, she is, bowled over by it. And I think she felt it was her reward, perhaps, for, you know, losing, not reward for it, but a compensation for losing her voice. But I think in the end, it was losing the music, losing the ability to sing, that was her real tragedy. And it is a tragedy. But on the other hand, she had some very, very good years. So I don't think of her as a kind of victim. I think of her as somebody who, you know, had a glorious sort of ascent, and then stopped. Every, especially the women, they had their claques, you know, their kind of followers who would go to see their performances and would boo the opposition and would applaud their heroine. And yeah, it was really a sort of a 360-degree event. You know, you couldn't kind of, you couldn't get away with an indifferent performance. You know, your fans were there and they were totally into it. I mean, they was like, you know, Maria Callas was the 50s equivalent of a Taylor Swift figure. Everybody knew everything and they were mouthing the words, and you know, it was a huge event. So I was just gripped by all of that. I wrote to Maria Callas. I mean, I listened to nothing but Maria Callas for about 3 years. And so, you know, everything I wrote, I had this kind of glorious voice in my ears and typing away. It was a very sort of sound and vision experience. I mean, it was a very 3D experience. I mean, and also I think that's how I like to write. I like to be able to see everything in my head, whether I'm writing a screenplay or a novel, whatever it is.
Well, how could you? Yeah, I was gonna say, how could you not, given your?
No, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how other people write. You know, I never know. I mean, I think other people. Yeah, I think I have a great friend who's more it's more about poetry for her. For me, it's all about. I like to make myself laugh when I'm writing, and I like to create a world, you know, that people can walk into.